Before Caesar, before Athens, before Rome even existed, powerful African queens commanded vast armies and built empires that stretched across 3 continents. Their names were erased from history books, but the evidence they left behind tells a story that will shake everything you thought you knew about ancient Europe. If you're ready to discover the hidden truth about Africa's forgotten queens who shaped European civilization, then stay with me until the end. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to learn isn't taught in any classroom. Let's begin. In a dusty archive in Lisbon, a researcher stumbled upon something extraordinary. Ancient maps, centuries old, showed African settlements dotting the coasts of Spain and Portugal. But these weren't trading posts or temporary camps. These were permanent colonies, complete with temples, fortifications, and administrative centers. The maps had been filed away and forgotten, labeled as curiosities from a time when cartographers supposedly didn't know any better. But the researcher knew better. She began digging deeper, and what she found would challenge everything the world thought it knew about ancient Europe. Across the Mediterranean, in southern Spain, construction workers building a new highway unearthed something that stopped the project cold. Statues, dozens of them, carved from dark stone, depicting figures with distinctly African features, wearing crowns and military regalia. The statues weren't Roman. They weren't Greek. They predated both civilizations by centuries. Local authorities wanted to quietly move them to storage, but photographs had already leaked. The question everyone started asking was simple, but profound. Who were these people, and why had no one ever heard of them? This story takes place in a world before Roman legions marched across Europe, before Greek philosophy dominated intellectual thought, before the Mediterranean was called by that name. Between 1500 and 500 years before the Common Era, the world looked radically different from what history books typically show. Africa wasn't a dark continent waiting to be civilized. It was a powerhouse of innovation, military might, and political sophistication. And its influence reached far beyond what anyone today would imagine. The Kingdom of Kush, located in what is now Sudan, stood as one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. While early European tribes were still developing basic agriculture, Kushite engineers were building pyramids that outnumbered even those of Egypt. The kingdom possessed iron weapons when much of Europe still relied on bronze. Their archers were feared across 3 continents. Their gold reserves were legendary. And unlike almost every other civilization of the ancient world, Kush had something truly revolutionary. They had a tradition of female rulers, who weren't just figureheads or regents. These were warrior queens who led armies into battle, negotiated treaties, and expanded empires. Queen Amanirenas rose to power in 40 BCE, during a time when Rome was already becoming the dominant force in the Mediterranean. She was middle-aged when she took the throne, a military veteran who had lost an eye in combat years earlier. Roman historians, writing decades later, would describe her with a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. They called her the One-Eyed Queen, a fierce woman who refused to bow to Caesar Augustus himself. When Roman forces pushed south into Nubian territory, demanding tribute and submission, Amanirenas did something that shocked the ancient world. She invaded Roman Egypt. Her armies swept north, catching Roman garrisons off guard. Kushite soldiers, trained in tactics the Romans had never encountered, used coordinated archery attacks and rapid cavalry movements to overwhelm the opposition. They captured several Roman forts and, in an act of deliberate symbolism, pulled down statues of Augustus and brought them back to Kush as war trophies. One of those bronze heads, depicting the emperor himself, was buried beneath the steps of a Kushite temple, so that everyone entering would literally walk over the face of Rome's most powerful man. Augustus sent reinforcements, and the war dragged on for 5 years. But here's what the history books rarely mention. Rome never truly won. After years of bloody conflict, with Roman supply lines stretched thin and Kushite resistance showing no signs of weakening, Augustus agreed to negotiate. The resulting treaty was remarkable. Kush maintained its independence, paid no tribute to Rome, and actually gained territory in the settlement. Amanirenas had fought the Roman Empire to a standstill. She returned home not as a conquered queen, but as a victor who had defended her kingdom against the era's greatest military machine. But Amanirenas wasn't unique. She was part of a tradition that stretched back centuries. The title these rulers held, Kandake, became synonymous with female power throughout the ancient world. Archaeological evidence shows that Kandakes ruled Kush for over 1,000 years, and their influence extended far beyond the African continent. Trade routes connected Kushite territories to Mediterranean ports, Arabian markets, and even distant India. And along these routes, Kushite power followed. Long before Rome became an empire, another African power had already established a vast network across the Mediterranean. The city of Carthage, founded in the 9th century BCE, became one of the ancient world's wealthiest and most influential states. And its founding story centers on a woman whose intelligence and strategic brilliance became legendary. Her name, recorded in various forms across different cultures, comes down to us as Dido. Historical records tell us she was a Phoenician princess who fled her homeland after her brother murdered her husband to seize his wealth. But Dido didn't run away to hide. She gathered loyal followers, secured her late husband's fortune, and sailed to North Africa with a plan. When she arrived on the coast of what is now Tunisia, she negotiated with local leaders for land. They agreed to give her as much territory as could be covered by an ox hide. It seemed like a joke, a tiny plot of land for the refugee princess. But Dido had the ox hide cut into the thinnest possible strips, then laid end to end in a massive circle. She claimed miles of coastal territory, and the local leaders, bound by their agreement, had to honor the deal. On that land, she built Carthage. Under Dido's leadership and the rulers who followed her example, Carthage became an empire. The Carthaginians established colonies throughout the Mediterranean. They controlled much of Spain, including valuable silver mines that funded their expansion. They held Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. They established trading posts along the coast of what is now France. Archaeological digs in these locations have uncovered distinctly North African pottery, coins, and inscriptions. These weren't temporary trading stations. These were administered territories, governed by Carthaginian officials, defended by Carthaginian soldiers, many of whom came from sub-Saharan African regions within Carthage's sphere of influence. The Carthaginian military included soldiers from across Africa. Numidian cavalry from what is now Algeria were considered the finest horsemen in the ancient world. Infantry units from regions south of the Sahara brought different fighting styles and weapons that European forces had never encountered. When these armies landed on European shores, they brought with them African military tactics, African administrative systems, and African cultural influences that would shape local populations for centuries. But military conquest wasn't the only way African power manifested in ancient Europe. Economic dominance proved equally effective. The Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopian tradition as Makeda, controlled trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world. Her kingdom's wealth came from gold, frankincense, myrrh, and exotic goods that European and Asian markets desperately wanted. Historical texts from multiple cultures reference her legendary visit to King Solomon in Jerusalem, but they often overlook the economic reality behind that journey. She wasn't a curious visitor. She was a powerful monarch negotiating trade agreements that would affect 3 continents. Evidence suggests that representatives from her kingdom, and possibly the queen herself, traveled throughout the Mediterranean world. Inscriptions found in southern Spain reference African merchants with royal connections. Port cities in ancient Greece have yielded artifacts from sub-Saharan Africa dating to this period, far more than could be explained by casual trade. These findings point to organized, systematic economic networks run by African powers who understood that controlling trade meant controlling territory, even without permanent military occupation. Recent archaeological work has uncovered something even more startling. In southern Portugal and Spain, excavations have revealed burial sites containing remains of individuals with sub-Saharan African ancestry, dating back over 2,000 years. DNA analysis confirms these weren't slaves or temporary visitors. The grave goods, the burial practices, and the locations all indicate these were people of significant social standing. Some graves contain military equipment. Others show evidence of wealth and administrative authority. These were African leaders who lived, ruled, and were honored in European territories long before Rome consolidated its power. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging technology have revealed ancient structures beneath modern European cities that match architectural styles found in North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Foundations of buildings, layout of streets, even water management systems show design principles that originated in African civilizations. In some cases, local legends preserved memories of these origins, speaking of dark-skinned queens and foreign rulers from the south, but historians dismiss these stories as myths or confused folktales. The physical evidence now proves those legends were historical memories, passed down through generations, waiting for someone to take them seriously. So what happened? How did such a significant chapter of human history become almost completely erased? The answer lies in understanding who writes history and why. When Rome finally rose to dominance in the Mediterranean, it did so through military conquest, but also through a sophisticated propaganda system. Roman writers chronicled their victories, but they also systematically diminished the achievements of those they conquered. Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, was literally destroyed. After the Third Punic War, Roman forces demolished the city so thoroughly that legend says they salted the earth so nothing could grow there. But they didn't just destroy the city. They destroyed its libraries, its historical records, its own accounts of its achievements. What survived came through Roman historians who had every reason to minimize Carthaginian accomplishments and portray them as barbaric enemies rather than a sophisticated rival civilization. References to African queens and African territories in Europe were edited, reinterpreted, or simply omitted from the historical record that would be passed to future generations. When later scholars during the Renaissance began studying classical texts, they worked primarily from Roman sources. The African perspective had already been erased. The colonial era, beginning in the 15th century, added another layer of historical distortion. European powers needed to justify the enslavement and colonization of African peoples. The narrative they constructed portrayed Africa as a continent without history, without civilization, without significant achievement. The idea that African queens had once ruled parts of Europe, that African armies had defeated European forces, that African economic power had shaped Mediterranean civilization. This idea contradicted everything colonial ideology required people to believe. So evidence was ignored, findings were misinterpreted, and alternative explanations were invented to explain away anything that didn't fit the approved narrative. But physical evidence is stubborn. It doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. Modern archaeological techniques, freed from colonial assumptions and equipped with technologies the Victorian era couldn't imagine, have begun reconstructing what really happened. Carbon dating, DNA analysis, metallurgical studies, linguistic research, and comparison of artistic styles across cultures are all revealing connections that were hidden for centuries. A new generation of historians, including many African scholars whose voices were previously excluded from academic discourse, are demanding that the evidence be examined honestly, wherever it leads. What they're finding is transforming our understanding of ancient Europe. Technologies once assumed to have originated in Greece or Rome actually came from Africa first. Certain architectural techniques found in Roman buildings match methods developed centuries earlier in Kush and Egypt. Agricultural practices in ancient Spain show African influence. Even some musical traditions in Mediterranean Europe can be traced back to African origins. The cultural exchange wasn't one-directional, with civilization flowing from north to south. It was multi-directional, with African innovations flowing north and east, transforming the societies they touched. The decline of African power in Europe came gradually, the result of multiple factors rather than a single catastrophic defeat. Rome's military innovations, particularly its disciplined infantry tactics and engineering capabilities, eventually gave it an advantage in prolonged conflicts. Climate changes in the first millennium BCE affected trade routes and agricultural productivity differently across regions, shifting economic advantages. The rise of new powers in the eastern Mediterranean created competition that hadn't existed before, and internal changes within African kingdoms, including succession disputes and shifting alliances, weakened their ability to project power across the sea. The last recorded African queen to wield significant influence in European territories lived in the 1st century BCE, just as Roman power reached its height. Historical records from that period, fragmented and often contradictory, suggest she ruled over territories in what is now southern Spain, maintaining control through a combination of military strength and economic leverage. When Roman forces finally absorbed those territories into their empire, they found a population that included African descendants who had lived there for generations, administrative systems based on African models, and cultural practices that blended African and local European traditions. Rome didn't conquer an empty land. It absorbed a region that had already been shaped by centuries of African influence. Today, the genetic legacy of that ancient African presence can still be found in Mediterranean populations. Studies of European DNA reveal African ancestry in regions where historical records claimed no significant African presence. The percentages are small, often just a few percent, but they're there, proof written in the human genome itself that people from sub-Saharan Africa didn't just visit ancient Europe. They lived there, had families there, and left descendants who remain to this day. Understanding this history matters for reasons that extend far beyond academic curiosity. For centuries, the narrative of human civilization has centered Europe as the source of progress, innovation, and cultural achievement, while portraying Africa as peripheral, primitive, and historically insignificant. That narrative has been used to justify atrocities, from slavery to colonialism to ongoing economic exploitation. But it's based on a lie. Africa wasn't peripheral to ancient civilization. It was central. African queens didn't just exist in their own kingdoms. They ruled territories in Europe, commanded armies that defeated European forces, and shaped the development of cultures that would later claim to have civilized the world. Reclaiming this history isn't about replacing one false narrative with another. It's about recognizing the full complexity of human achievement. Every continent, every culture has contributed to the development of civilization. The ancient world was interconnected in ways that would surprise most people today. Queens from Kush negotiated with emperors in Rome. Carthaginian generals, some of African descent, led campaigns across Europe. Trade networks connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean and beyond. And through all of this, African women held power not as exceptions or anomalies, but as recognized leaders whose authority was accepted across multiple continents. New discoveries continue to emerge. Just last year, researchers in Greece announced the finding of inscription fragments that reference an African queen by name, describing her visit to negotiate a trade agreement. In Morocco, excavations have uncovered what appears to be a training facility for female warriors, complete with weapons and armor designed for women's bodies. In Spain, analysis of ancient coins has revealed that some bear the profiles of African rulers, struck in European territories under their control. Each finding adds another piece to a puzzle that historians are only beginning to assemble. The resistance to these findings from some traditional scholars reveals how deeply invested certain narratives have become in the academic establishment. Accepting that African queens ruled parts of ancient Europe requires rethinking fundamental assumptions about how civilization developed, who held power, and what ancient societies actually looked like. It challenges the comfortable myth of a white European antiquity that later became the foundation for Western civilization. But challenging myths is what good history does. It takes the evidence seriously, even when that evidence contradicts what people want to believe. The story of these African queens isn't just about correcting the historical record, though that's important. It's about understanding human potential and the arbitrary nature of how we've divided ourselves. The women who built Carthage, who fought Rome to a standstill, who controlled trade routes across 3 continents, they weren't superhuman. They were people who lived in societies that gave women opportunities for power and leadership. They had access to education, military training, and political authority. And they used those opportunities to achieve things that would be remarkable in any era. Their story was nearly lost. For centuries, it existed only in fragments, in archaeological evidence that was misinterpreted or ignored, in legends that were dismissed as fantasy, in genetic traces that no one knew how to read. But the truth has a way of surviving. It waits in buried cities and ancient texts. It persists in DNA and cultural memory. And when people are finally ready to listen, it speaks. The history they taught you was incomplete. These African queens built empires, commanded armies, and ruled European lands centuries before Rome became a superpower. If this story opened your eyes, then share it with someone who needs to hear the truth. Subscribe to this channel because we're just getting started uncovering the hidden chapters of human history. Drop a comment below telling me which queen's story shocked you the most. And remember, history belongs to those brave enough to seek the truth. I'll see you in the next one.